That winter morning was so cold that even the sun seemed afraid to rise. The wind moved through the empty streets like a whisper of hunger. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes people walk faster, heads down, hearts closed. And that was the day a little girl walked home barefoot. But she wasn't born without shoes. She chose to give them away. What she didn't know was that 20 years later, that same barefoot kindness would return to her. Not as a thank you, not as a simple gift, but as something so life-changing that the entire town would stand in silence. Before we begin this unforgettable journey of love, sacrifice, and destiny, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to The Spoken Pen. And tell us in the comments which part of the world you are watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let me tell you about the girl who gave away her shoes. Her name was Sarah Williams. She was 12 years old, with soft brown eyes and hair that never quite stayed tied in its ribbon. She lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and where dreams were often smaller than the houses people lived in. Sarah's family was not rich. In fact, they struggled quietly. Her father worked double shifts at a local warehouse, and her mother stitched clothes at home for extra money. They didn't complain. They just kept going. Sarah studied at Maplewood Elementary School, a red brick building that had seen generations pass through its narrow halls. The floors creaked, the paint peeled, but the teachers cared deeply. Sarah loved that school. She loved the smell of chalk dust in the air. She loved the library that held more stories than she could ever read. She loved the playground, even though her sneakers were old and the soles were beginning to thin. Those sneakers were special to her. They were white once. Now they were slightly gray with faded blue stripes. Her parents had saved for months to buy them. Sarah wore them everywhere. She cleaned them carefully each night with a damp cloth, making them last longer than they should have. On that cold December afternoon, school ended early because the temperature had dropped below freezing. The teachers rushed children out the gates, reminding them to go straight home. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself and started walking. That was when she saw him. He was sitting near the old bus stop bench, curled up like a question mark. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His hair was messy, his cheeks red from the cold, and he had no shoes. His feet were bare against the frozen pavement. Sarah slowed down. She looked around. Adults passed by. Cars drove past. No one stopped. The boy's hands were shaking. His lips were slightly blue. Sarah felt something twist inside her chest. She walked closer. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The boy looked up. His eyes were dark and wide, filled with fear and something else, shame. He nodded even though he was clearly not okay. "Where are your shoes?" Sarah asked. He didn't answer. After a few seconds he whispered, "I lost them." His voice was thin, almost carried away by the wind. Sarah looked at her own sneakers. They weren't new. They weren't fancy. But they were warm. She hesitated. If she gave them away, she would have to walk home barefoot. The ground was freezing. Her house was still 20 minutes away. She thought of her parents. They would be upset. Not angry but worried. She thought of the cold pavement biting her feet. Then she looked back at the boy. He was younger than her little cousin. He looked so small against the empty street. Without allowing herself to think again, Sarah sat down on the curb. She untied her laces. The boy watched, confused. "What are you doing?" he asked. "You can have mine," Sarah said simply. His eyes widened. "I can't take your shoes." "You can," she insisted gently. "I live close." That was not entirely true. But kindness doesn't always calculate distance. She slid her sneakers off and placed them in front of him. The cold hit her feet instantly. It felt like stepping into ice. She tried not to flinch. The boy stared at the shoes as if they were made of gold. "Why?" he whispered. Sarah shrugged. "Because you need them." The boy slowly put them on. They were slightly big, but he didn't care. He stood up, wiggling his toes inside the warmth. For the first time he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Thank you," he said. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Daniel." "I'm Sarah." They stood there for a moment, two children in the middle of a cold world. "Where do you live?" Sarah asked. Daniel pointed vaguely down the street. "I stay wherever I can." Sarah didn't fully understand what that meant. She was young, but she understood enough. "Take care, Daniel," she said. "You too," he replied. Sarah turned and began walking. The first step was the hardest. The cold pavement burned. It felt like thousands of tiny needles pressing into her skin. She clenched her teeth and kept walking. By the time she reached home, her feet were red and numb. Small cuts had appeared on her soles. Her mother gasped when she opened the door. "Sarah, where are your shoes?" Sarah tried to smile. "I gave them to someone who needed them more." Her mother didn't scold her. Instead, she knelt down, wrapped Sarah's feet in warm towels, and pressed her forehead against her daughter's. "You have your father's heart," she whispered. That night, Sarah's feet hurt badly, but her heart felt warm. She never saw Daniel again. Winter passed. Spring came. Life moved forward. Sarah grew up. Years rolled by like pages in a book. She studied hard, determined to become a teacher. She wanted to give children what her school had given her, hope. Maplewood Elementary became her dream. But dreams are fragile when money is tight. After high school, her father fell sick. Medical bills piled up. Sarah worked part-time jobs while attending college. She nearly gave up many times. There were nights she cried quietly, staring at unpaid tuition notices. But every time she thought of quitting, she remembered the feeling of giving away her shoes. That moment had taught her something powerful. What you give away in love never truly leaves you. Years later, Sarah achieved her goal. She returned to Maplewood Elementary, this time as Miss Williams. The building looked older. The paint peeled more. The playground equipment was rusted. Funding had been cut repeatedly. The school struggled to survive. But Sarah poured her heart into it. She stayed late to tutor students. She bought supplies with her own small salary. She listened to children who had no one else to talk to. She became the kind of teacher who changes lives quietly. 20 years passed. Sarah was now 32. Her parents had both passed away. The house she grew up in had been sold to pay medical debts. She lived in a small apartment and walked to school every morning. One afternoon, the principal called an emergency meeting. "The school board has decided," he said, his voice heavy. "Maplewood Elementary will close at the end of this year. Lack of funds." The room fell silent. Teachers cried. For Sarah, it felt like losing her childhood all over again. The building that shaped her was dying. The children would be scattered to different schools miles away. That evening, Sarah stayed late, sitting alone in her classroom. She touched the wooden desks. She looked at the chalkboard. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Outside, black cars pulled into the parking lot. Expensive black cars. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too lost in her thoughts. Then there was a knock on her classroom door. She turned. A tall man stood there. He wore a tailored coat. His hair was neatly styled. Confidence radiated from him, but so did something softer. "Miss Williams?" he asked. "Yes." He stepped inside. "I've been looking for you for a long time." Sarah frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The man smiled. You gave me your shoes. The world seemed to stop. Sarah blinked. I'm sorry. 20 years ago, he said gently. A freezing December afternoon. You were 12. I was 8. Sitting barefoot near a bus stop. Sarah's hand slowly rose to her mouth. Daniel, she whispered. He nodded. She stared at him. The small shivering boy was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he owned the world. I never forgot, Daniel said. You were the first person who saw me. Not as a problem. Not as a burden. Just as someone who mattered. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. I always wondered what happened to you. Daniel took a deep breath. That day after you left, someone from a local shelter found me. I ended up in foster care. It wasn't easy, but I kept thinking about you. About how someone who didn't have much gave everything. He paused. That moment changed me. I promised myself that if I ever became something in life, I would give back the way you did. Sarah's voice trembled. And did you? Daniel smiled softly. I built a tech company. Sold it 3 years ago. Her eyes widened. You? Yes, he said gently. I did well. He looked around the classroom. I heard this school is closing. Sarah nodded, tears falling freely now. There isn't enough funding. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. I'd like to change that. He placed the folder on her desk. Sarah opened it slowly. Inside were documents, architectural plans, financial statements. At the top was a headline, Daniel Harper Educational Foundation. Her heart pounded. I don't understand, she whispered. Daniel's voice was steady. I've purchased the land, the building. I'm funding full renovations, new classrooms, technology labs, scholarships. Sarah stared at him. Why? He looked at her the same way he had 20 years ago, with gratitude and quiet wonder. Because once a girl walked home barefoot so I wouldn't have to. He swallowed. I can't give you back your shoes, but I can give you your school. Sarah broke down completely. She covered her face and sobbed. Daniel stepped closer, his voice soft. You didn't just give me shoes, Sarah. You gave me dignity. You gave me warmth when the world was cold. Within months, Maplewood Elementary transformed. Fresh paint, bright classrooms, a new library named the Williams Wing. A small plaque near the entrance read, dedicated to Sarah Williams, whose simple act of kindness proved that small sacrifices can build great futures. On reopening day, the entire town gathered. Children laughed in a playground that no longer creaked. Teachers hugged each other. Sarah stood beside Daniel as the ribbon was cut. Reporters asked Daniel why he chose this town. He looked at Sarah before answering. Because this is where someone believed in me when I had nothing. Later, when the crowd dispersed, Sarah found Daniel standing quietly near the old bus stop down the street. She walked beside him. It's warmer today, she said softly. He smiled. Yes, it is. They stood there for a moment, not as a rich man and a teacher, but as two souls connected by a single act of kindness. You know, Daniel said, I kept those shoes for years. Sarah laughed through her tears. They must have fallen apart. They did, he admitted. But I kept the laces. She looked at him touched. Why? To remind myself that warmth isn't about what you wear. It's about what you give. The wind blew gently now. Not harsh. Not cruel. Just a quiet reminder of how far they had come. And somewhere in the halls of Maplewood Elementary, children ran freely, unaware that their future had been secured by a pair of old white sneakers. Sometimes the smallest act becomes the biggest miracle. Sometimes a barefoot walk becomes a foundation for generations. And sometimes, love given without expectation returns 20 years later, carrying a school in its hands. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Spoken Pen. And tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from, because kindness travels farther than we ever imagine.